Now, there is a game design principle which I use every single day in my job as a game designer. I teach to all my students at university and is the foundation of a significant portion of the 100 plus cool mechanics I have covered on this channel. But in over 200 total videos, I haven't covered it explicitly. And that principle is what I would like to call Gabe sauce. Gabe sauce for me is boiled down to a single quote from Gabe Newell himself about Valve's definition of fun, which was founded ad hoc during the development of Valve's first game, Half-Life.
And so we had to come up with some notion of what fun was. We knew it was an ad hoc definition, and it was the degrees to which the game recognizes and responded to the player's choices and actions.
This quote is just 15 words, yet what it means is so much more, and this video is about breaking down exactly what every game designer should learn and action from this quote. Now, the two angles we're going to come at this from are, firstly, a strict practical game design perspective, being the theory and methodology around player agency, and secondly, the behavioral science perspective, specifically breaking down examples from Valve games of reinforcers and reinforcement schedules. So firstly, what is player agency and why is it important? So player agency is the player's ability and allowed freedom to make perceived or actual meaningful choices which affects gameplay and narrative. To give an example, you could look at a narrative decision game like Telltale, where the outcome branches narrative, or in a game like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, where the player has many options to tackle encounters, such as throwing a stone to move someone away, speaking to them, or fighting them. Gabe also has a quote around why player agency is important.
If I go up to a wall and shoot it, to me, it feels like the wall is ignoring me. I'm getting a narcissistic injury when the world is ignoring me. So does this, like, to me, I was trying to convey to the user a sense of, yes, you were making choices. Yes, you were progressing, which meant the game had to acknowledge that back to you. If you shoot at a wall, there have to be decals. If you kill a bunch of Marines, the Marines have to run away from you, right?
This quote is incredibly useful for designers to hear and understand for a few reasons. The main reason is that game design should always be player first. Avoiding what he describes as players being inflicted with a narcissistic injury due to the game ignoring them is a great way to ensure that the player is always at the forefront when it comes to design, and is a good anchor for when you are making design decisions. He uses an example of whenever a bullet hits a wall in Counter-Strike, there should always be decals, which is a very basic and simple way of showing and reinforcing the impact a player has on the world. But another example, which is something designers and developers are tackling in every new game today, is when I shoot an enemy, it should run away, which is an example found in Half-Life. AI is an incredibly complicated thing to get right in games, and in order to create that feeling of player agency, games throughout the years have tried to implement reaction systems in many different ways. For example, in the original Halo, they used a relatively primitive but also effective squad-based hierarchy system, where grunts were assigned to higher ranking Covenant units like the elites, and the grunt AI would be continuously tracking whether that elite was alive or not, and if they were dead, a behavior would trigger, forcing them to flee and panic. This is a great example of constantly reinforced cause and effect, which is obvious to the player and provides them with the feeling of player agency. The choice which gives that feeling of player agency is choosing to kill the elite first, hence the term squad-based hierarchy, so that the grunts stop shooting them. Another example is from famed immersive sim designer Ken Levine and his approach to narrative design. During a GDC talk in 2014, he referred to his approach to narrative design as using narrative Legos. I wanted to create a world where the narrative could be broken into pieces and reassembled based on players' choices. Again, putting the player and their effects on the world at the forefront, and again protecting them from that narcissistic injury. Now, going back to Valve, let's take a look at games other than Half-Life and Counter-Strike. Firstly, before talking for a bit about Portal 2, I will say that the original Portal did a few things which are great to acknowledge the player. One example being when the player gets themselves stuck inside a chamber.
You're not a good person. You know that, right?
But yeah, Portal 2 does two things I really want to talk about, and the first one isn't even in the game. So when Portal 2 was on the horizon, Valve started releasing what looked like quite expensive cinematic trailers to make. One of these trailers was just pretty cool originally to watch, but retrospectively, when looking at it from the lens of the Gabe source, it's so clear why they did it. So in the original Portal, you could take fall damage. This fall damage was never really something the player had to actively deal with, as it was just simply a lose condition if you fell off the map or fell somewhere where you shouldn't be. However, in Portal 2, they wanted to make the levels bigger, much bigger, but didn't want the player to have to deal with the pre-established fall damage. Another developer might have simply just assumed that firstly, the player doesn't care, or secondly, that the player will understand the difference between falling in an active part of the level or falling off the level. Not Valve though. They made an entire trailer justifying this change, presenting the long fall boot. Now this isn't a practical example for most developers, as they just don't have Valve money to be able to do something like this, but it is just actually insane and I needed to mention it. However, the second example is more practical. In Portal and Portal 2, the rule was always that you could only shoot portals on white panels. This is probably the most restrictive aspect of the game and is of course very much required for a puzzle game with already so much freedom. However, towards the back half of the game, Valve tweaked this rule, or at least recontextualized it to be you can only shoot portals on white surfaces. This change is introduced with the conversion gel, which is, you guessed it, white gel which can make any surface portable. I think that this decision is incredibly impressive to even make in the first place, as the puzzle design would have had to have been completely flipped on its head, forcing designers to think completely differently to make puzzles interesting. Additionally, to be introduced so late in the game where you have to maintain a level of difficulty to keep the player in that flow state is an extra layer of challenge for the designer. But what it does do is it adds so much to the agency of the player. It allows for puzzles and traversal to be handled in so many ways that were previously unimaginable, and it's all fueled by the player. Alongside this, it is told to the player that the gel is made up of moon dust, so what does the game allow you to do right at the end? Shoot a portal on the moon. Incredible. Another example of a Valve game which creates a lot of player agency is Team Fortress and Team Fortress 2. Team Fortress is widely regarded as the first ever hero shooter, however there is something to be argued with Star Siege Tribes, which came out a year earlier being the first hero shooter, as it did have loadout based roles. But for me, Team Fortress takes it that step further to really make the player feel like they are playing different characters. To explain why the core fundamentals of a hero shooter, being the cast of heroes to choose, is great for player agency, I'll use a quote from one of the designers of League of Legends, being Alexander Brazzi. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Hero shooters give players agency by letting them express themselves through characters that feel like extensions of their personality and tactical preference. The tactical preference as part of the quote is where I really want to hone in on for Team Fortress 1. There were the classes you will have grown to know and love from Team Fortress 2, the medic, the spy, etc. All of which are designed very distinctly to play differently through their core stats and their weapons and tools at their disposal. The actual act of picking a hero, even before the player is playing them, has a deep layer of player agency which gives the player the feeling of control and impact over the game. This is coupled with the fact that the dynamic of the team they are in is also heavily influenced by their decision, and that decision further impacts the players on both sides of the match. When it comes to the other part of that quote, letting them express themselves through characters that feel like extensions of their personality, I would like to focus on Team Fortress 2 for that. Now, as you could probably guess, this is the most obvious difference between the games. Team Fortress 2 now not only has distinctly feeling characters, but distinctly sounding and looking characters as well. Now, I hope most people don't think that any of these characters are actual true extensions of themselves, as none of them are particularly the nicest people, but you can definitely have your favorite. Pyro is the one for me. This change is clearly very intentional from Valve, wanting to further immerse the player in that decision, which creates so much player agency. This is coupled with the fact that, very similar to Portal 2, this design decision was so important to reinforce to the player that it birthed the Meet the series.
Oh my God, who touched Sasha? All right. Who touched my gun?
A mockumentary-style short-form series where players were introduced to each member of the cast. Now, I don't know if you remember the agonizing wait for Pyro short film, but I do. Now, sticking with Team Fortress 2, I would now like to look at the other ingredient of Gabe sauce, the other angle to look at this whole thing, reinforcers and reinforcement schedules. Now, a game mode which was introduced in Team Fortress 2 in 2008 is now very common in most other hero shooters: Payload. Payload does do a lot for player agency, as a tactical aspect of when to push, when to step away, where the payload is at, and how that affects the positioning of everyone on the field creates a very dynamic and player-focused experience. But instead of going into too much detail with regards to that, I instead want to say that Payload wasn't a Valve idea originally. Tribes 2, released in 2001, 7 years before Payload was introduced in Team Fortress 2, had community mods which introduced mobile objectives to the game. Return to Castle Wolfenstein, also released in 2001, again also had custom maps and modes which had this escort style objective. This was later made official especially in Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, released in 2003, where there were several missions in the campaign which had escort missions. However, in saying all that, there was one thing which Valve did which really set it apart and made it a mainstay in the player's hearts, which is reinforcers and reinforcement schedules. Whenever the player is near a payload, the character will, on a specific schedule, bark something related to the payload. This, alongside the visual feedback when influencing the payload, coupled with the payload being on a visible track rather than a more random feeling escort mission, and the fact that players need to actually be near the payload at all to move it, are all the ways that the design uses reinforcement to make the player feel like they are actually influencing the objective. This is the same but also different to, say, a King of the Hill style objective where you have to sit on something whilst it's captured. The presentation and design of payload is such that it makes the player feel like they are actively pushing the payload rather than just waiting, like physically pushing it. Now, reinforcement is a huge deal, not just for fun or for player agency, but just in general. The reason for this is tied to trust. Trust that the game works the way you expect it to, and every time you interact with it in the way that you were taught, it works. This does wonders for the whole idea of Gabe sauce, that the game respects and acknowledges the player's existence. A game cannot be everything, it cannot do everything. Even in games like Baldur's Gate 3 or Dwarf Fortress, where it feels like you can do anything, eventually you will find a way to try to do something which you just simply cannot do. So to deal with that, games should use reinforcement to implicitly teach the player the rules of the world, so that it's not even a thought that would enter their head to try and break something. Portal 1 does a great job of this in particular. I actually made an entire video on Portal 1 and how the entire game is essentially one big tutorial that the player doesn't realise they are playing. But to summarise, every puzzle room has a purpose, and that purpose is to either teach or reinforce. In the 12 or so puzzles you do before you get to the dual portal device, the player repeats the same actions multiple times, like putting a cube on a button or launching themselves with momentum or moving cubes through portals. They always act the same, they always present themselves in the same way, it is constantly reinforced, and the reinforcement is on strict schedules so the player never loses that implicit lessons they were taught. Another example of reinforcement is from Half-Life 2, and has actually already been well covered and explained by YouTuber and developer Game Maker's Toolkit, who actually met in real life at Develop Brighton a couple of years ago and literally froze. Like, I called him over because I saw him, just blurted out his name, Mark, and then when he got to me, I just didn't know what to say. But I did get a picture, so can't complain. Anyway, here's the clip of reinforcement used in Half-Life 2 from his video.
When you first enter Ravenholm, you see this, a dead zombie chopped in half with a saw blade in its stomach. Then, you notice that the doorway to the next section is blocked by this table and these blades. You pluck a blade out of the wall with your gravity gun, and at that moment, a zombie wanders into view. You instinctively hit the fire button, and wha-pow! You chop the sucker in half. And that's it. In about 10 seconds, Valve has taught you that saw blades are an effective weapon against zombies without making you read anything and without treating you like an infant.
And finally, I want to go back to the example I mentioned right at the start, or more so Gabe Newell mentioned. The fact that whenever you shoot a bullet and it hits a surface, there should be decals showing that impact. Now, games like Battlefield or Voidbreaker have taken this further with destructibility that is incredibly difficult to actually pull off, but is of course great for reinforcing the impact the player has over the environment. But with it being so difficult, it's why I want to pull back to the specifics of that quote: decals.
If you shoot at a wall, there have to be decals.
Very minor, easy to implement feedback assets such as decals can and are often overlooked in games. And when considering player first development and design, starting at the basics and the fundamentals is always a great way to go about it. Start small and work up within scope. It will be felt if not recognized by the player, which is what game design is all about. Now, like in almost all of my videos, I want to stay clear of shedding light on bad examples of whatever I'm talking about. The point of this channel isn't to bring anything down, but instead raise games up, as games are great after all. However, hopefully my point hasn't been lost due to the lack of examples in games which seemingly don't have player first design, as I can imagine most people would be able to think of an example from a game they have played themselves, and sadly player first design isn't as common as you would hope. But with that being said, hopefully you enjoyed my take on the Gabe sauce. The Gabe sauce is good, and if it was more widely available for purchase, maybe more of us will be making the next Half-Life. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this type of content and want others to see it too, make sure to leave a like on the video, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when I next upload a video. Thanks for watching again, and keep on keeping on.